Well, good morning, everybody. Hopefully, you've had some time to get that first cup of coffee. Maybe you put yourself together as well as Mark has this morning. He's way, way above our standards. I'm sure that his insight to the scriptures will be equally up in the stratosphere as well. And so it's great to have Mark with us. We'll start with Terry, though. Terry, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing really good. I'm a little bit anxious. Last time I was with somebody this early in the morning, this overdressed, I was in the principal's office in school. So I just don't know what to take of this. I'm really impressed, by the way. Mark's on the West Coast, which means it's like 8 o'clock. He got up early in the morning and he put on a suit and tie, and I barely found a shirt this morning. I'm just really impressed by his eagerness and zeal to get going this early. I said I was going to be on my best behavior. I've already ruined that, Mark, but thank you. It's good to be with you today.
Mark, how are you doing this morning?
You know, doing great out here in Beaverton, Oregon, which is very near Portland, right on the west side of Portland. And it's good to see you again. It's good to meet Terry. And yeah, the cat actually helps. My cat gets me up at 6 o'clock every morning, and so lets me know like, hey, time to get the show on the road. And I remember years ago, I was in the principal office. I was in first grade, and a kid had kind of thrown up all over the place, and that scared the daylights out of me. And I was determined not to go to school anymore. And so I met with the principal, but the rumor that started around the first grade class was that since the principal was Spanish, that I was getting private Spanish lessons with him. So I became quite a celebrity in first grade for a while.
I'll just say that my visits
I
to the
just got to
principal
say,
office were a lot different than yours. They
yeah.
involved the
And
paddle,
the
and
rumors
it was
that
a
were spread
thing.
about me, yeah, were nothing about me being specially tutored to learn a new language. They were
Yeah,
pretty dead on accurate about
yeah.
why I was in the future.
Here's some facts
Uh,
for you. This is NorCal
yeah,
facts. The
yes.
Alice Elementary School had a paddle in California in the 70s, and it was in use. So those are straight facts. I can
Dude,
represent.
TA, TA Duggar Middle School in the late 80s in Elizabethton, Tennessee had a paddle, and it was actually with holes in it. And then
Drill holes for
and then
speed.
the holes for speed. But worse, my sophomore year of high school, which is early 90s, there was a paddle I got to get intimate with that was also swung by the baseball hitting coach for the team. And the handle was shaped on a lay like a baseball bat.
Yeah.
And we were in a pod, and six classes got to see him raise me off the ground through miraculous intervention of wood. So
Yes.
I'm just going to tell you, we grew up in a different time, and I was never rooming to be in the principal's office because I was learning Spanish. That's
Yes.
no wonder you're in a suit.
Every single trip there was justified. I'm just going to leave it
Mine
at that.
too.
Leave it at that.
Phil and I are examples of grace. That's what we're learning so far this morning. First Corinthians chapter 5. Let's get
Hey,
into
we're
it.
four. Turn your page back.
Oh, four. Sorry. There you
Don't
go. I
don't
got
don't freak Mark
upstairs.
out. He'd be fine.
Yeah.
So
Well, he
let's.
knows Spanish. Surely he can handle chapter 5 too. I mean, come on. He learned in first grade.
Don't tempt me.
Yeah.
First Corinthians chapter 4. A couple things we've stressed in the beginning of the text in our introduction. We're going to bring back into the table now. The first three chapters lay out the foundation of the instruction or wisdom that Paul is now going to dispense. First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, the correspondence with the church at Corinth, are kind of two separate parts of the whole narrative. You've got First Corinthians, this is all the instruction. You got Second Corinthians, this is all the encouragement. And that's how we've structured them for this study. A couple other things that are really important is to recognize that there are layers of transformation that take place. This is the transformed Paul that's writing to them. The church at Corinth has begun the transformation process, but it's obviously hit some cultural, some spiritual, some significant snags. In the first three chapters, one of the things that I really love about it is that Paul reaches to them as brethren rather than rejects. I think that's a cultural issue amongst some Christians at times to be able to think to those who are struggling as still in Christ or still saints, but yet broken. And there's a lot of loose space in between those two things that we kind of see in the text. And some of it's maybe not as specific as we would like it to be. So by the time we get to chapter 4, he has turned the pendulum from, it swung a little bit from, all right, here's all the introductory stuff. Here's the context of the problem, to now, by the fourth chapter, it's now really going to get into the heart of it. This is now details. Chapter 5 is going to be tough to kind of wade through when we get there. Chapter 4 opens it up. And he focuses now, though, on the work that he and Paul did, or he and Apollos do, to strengthen these brethren over the course of their spiritual endeavors. And right now, if we could, Terry, do you want to read verses, say, 1 through 5 of chapter 4 to get us rolling?
Absolutely. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God.
All right, as we usually do, this block of text. We've got 5 verses here. What's important? What's noteworthy? What do we need to know, both to understand it in its first century context, but also to make application in the 21st century and beyond?
I like verse 1. I like the word servant and stewards. Both, one's an under rower. One's the idea that, and both, the steward would have a lot of responsibility, but he worked for somebody else. And I like that Paul was not here to present his own theology, is that Paul represents Christ. And then the word mystery, he's a steward of the mysteries of God, reminded me like of that passage in 1 Peter chapter 1, 10 to 12, of where the gospel is at one point, angels long to look into that message. Prophets wanted to know who, what, when. And that's a message that Paul has the privilege, and us today, we have the privilege of presenting, like the gospel. What is it? It's God's mystery revealed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that there. It really ties in well into the third chapter, when Paul was trying to subside the idea that Apollos and he and others were super important in comparison to Jesus, who should have been their focus. And so now he's retelling them that we're just servants. We are bringing you, and we can use this analogy a little bit, the meal. We're just carrying it from the cooks who made it to the table where it's going to dine upon, and it's a feast if you decide to partake. And I think there's a lot to that we'll see play out. What else is going on here, Terry?
Well, it's interesting that some commentators think that these 5 verses probably would be better fitting with chapter 3, because there's kind of this 2-stage discourse about the first, what we looked at yesterday, how you view yourself, and then Paul turns that onto how they view servants of God, other people. And that those two things kind of contextually go together. And there is kind of this interesting idea there when you put those two together, that the Corinthian brethren had failed to judge themselves appropriately. And there seems to be a little bit of, we've talked about how that Paul kind of has this a little bit sarcastic tone. And when you kind of look at that in these verses, there's kind of this idea of, you're not judging yourself, but here you are judging us. Don't judge us. God's going to judge us just like he'll judge you, and wait till the appropriate time for that. The other thing that sticks out to me in some of the stuff I read preparing for this morning was, I think it was Wright that wrote, in fact, I just pulled it up, it was Wright that said, in regards to the judgment in this statement, especially in verse 5, the bringing to light things hidden in darkness, this idea of judgment, he said that some religious systems try to make out that the world isn't so bad after all, and that evil is just an illusion. But in Christianity, it's clear that the world is God's good and lovely world, and evil is a real, powerful, and horrible intruder in it. And I just thought it was really interesting comment to think about in those ways. Just hear this judgment, the light coming out of the darkness, that, there's a very real approach to the world here in that sense, that what we see in the world is there's evil and good, and that's all going to be exposed when that judgment comes. And there is this idea that there's an appropriate time for that. Don't bring that on before the time's right. And I think that's by the way, that reminds me in this case with the Corinthian brethren, this letter kind of reminds me of Amos in a way, kind of connected those two things together where, Amos, I'm sure Corinth, maybe they felt like in some regards they weren't ready, but maybe some did. But in Amos's day, Israel felt like, hey, bring on the day of the Lord. And Amos said, you don't want the day of the Lord. That's bad news for you. And it's almost like in this here, hey, don't bring on judgment too soon. You're not ready for that. I think there's a little bit of that tone in here as well in these first 5 verses. There's some things that's popped into my mind as kind of looking through things this morning.
Yeah, there's 2 literary pictures. Mark, go ahead. I saw you.
Yes, another thing, something Terry, I think, reminded me of is that if you have an inaccurate view of yourself, you're not going to be able to judge other people appropriately. That those 2 things go together. They kind of had an inflated view of themselves, which it looks like not only in Corinth is there a I'm of Paul, Apollos, or I'm of Apollos, Peter, but it looks like along with that, this chapter kind of brings it out, that went with that was I'm against Paul. Looks like there's kind of an anti-Paul sentiment running through some of these verses.
Yeah,
no doubt. And I think there's a great picture we can open up. If we remember the parable of the talents from the teaching of Jesus and the way in which people were entrusted with certain blessings and how they responded to it, all the way down to the guy who says, I'm going to bury it in the ground because I have a harsh taskmaster. That picture opens up this dialogue for me a little bit, and I start thinking about it. Okay, that's kind of what we see here. They've been entrusted with a message that they need to share, but instead they're fighting over and bickering over and talking about who's the best money manager. And then there's one more that comes in the same package from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. There, Paul writes, Timothy, O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. That's a great intertextual connection to see Paul basically teaching the same truth in 2 different venues. You've got to guard it, but share it. But you have to guard it and share it in a way that doesn't get impacted by, as the ESV translate it, irreverent babble. And that's basically like Facebook some days is a good modern illustration, or social media every day. Every now and then there's a kernel of truth that peeks its way out of the black hole that is social media. Every now and then.
I think it's also interesting that he says it's a very small thing in verse 3 that I should be judged by you. I can't help but read that a little bit.
There's some sarcasm
kind of back from Paul, like, pure sarcasm, like, hey, look, go ahead and judge me. Who are you? Like, really, come on, kind of thing. I just think that's kind of interesting in that. And I do think, like Mark said, there's a very much this kind of cliquish thing around these teachers. And if you were a Paul, well, then not only were you preferring Paul, but you were judging Apollos to not be equal to Paul. And it's interesting in this text, what he's going to bring back to is really making him and Apollos and Cephas and any other teacher equal in this next section. But there's certainly a very real portion of that. And so, I think part of this is he's saying, don't, it's a small thing for you to judge me. All the people who weren't of Paul were judging him in that sense. And I just think it's important to kind of see that in the text.
I like, Phil, going back to verse, I think, end of chapter 3, the idea that all things belong to you, is that you don't have to choose. You don't have to choose between Paul and Apollos and Peter. We all serve the same Lord. We all preach the same message. The thought there about the judging here is interesting, because a person might read this the first time and go like, well, it looks like Paul doesn't even practice any personal self-examination. And it's like, well, no. The same writer said, judge yourself, see if you're in the faith. But I think the thought that Paul is saying is that, and it's refreshing, Paul says, the only judgment that matters is the one at the last day. Even if I look at my own life right now and think, I'm doing pretty good, that doesn't mean I'm acquitted. I mean, I'm not omniscient. I need to look in the Word, and the only thing that really is going to stick, finally, is Jesus' judgment. But I like the refreshing attitude. Basically, he kind of tells the Corinthians, I have no ego here, and your opinion doesn't move the dial for me.
Yeah. And that's a strong connection to the humility that Paul acquired. Saul's opinion mattered. It's part of the veneer of his strength is kind of seen in that. And Paul, the transformed human that he becomes more spiritually connected to God with, is much more comfortable with admitting his faults, his failures in the text. You see that open up. He even talks about himself a lot more rather than our first look at him, which is all external. Um, a couple of things. Quick note, Hal, you make all the comments you like because you have good comments. And so you can try to promise to not say anything else, but you are released from that vow. And then Tim Beckley brought out this. He says, a robust shout out to faithfulness, a foundational part of relationships and a bedrock quality of how God describes himself using chesed and saris, loyal love. And so both the Old and New Testament bring these language tools in that talk about a kind of love that's steadfast, that's committed to a cause higher than the temporal nature of our hearts, which are fleeting and scoot across all kinds of various spots. I want to make one quick, very pointed application. It ties back to a conversation that Terry and I had about 6 months ago. Very often we get territorial in these issues. And there's kind of a connection, like we'll say, I am of, and I'll use these things very plainly, magazine A, magazine B, Christianity magazine, Truth magazine. That's nonsense. It's straight talk.
Oh, wait. Funny you brought that up, because this morning as I was preparing, I thought, man, this is just like our conversation from 6 months ago.
Right. But I want to make the next layer to it, because we use that as a narrative to talk about the difficulties of working with our brethren in the 90s and early 2000s. And we use that narrative to talk about it. But bring it more close to home, because I think that's where this text really needs to be applied, not so much in church-to-church relationship, but Christian-to-Christian. Shepherds, deacons, evangelists, all sharing the work of the Lord in a local church. All three of those different roles, and we'll include teachers to make it 4, have to learn to profit from one another's strengths rather than tear each other's work down. And so the evangelist needs to praise the shepherding of the elders, and the elders needs to praise the teaching that takes place through the Bible class teachers and the service of the deacons. And then those parts turn back and praise the good news spreading that takes place from the evangelist, the minister. I will say that while we can apply those externally, textually, it's all right in the core of the message itself to a congregation, a flock, if you will.
Yeah, I think one of the healthiest things that comes out of this is just that awareness that the Lord's going to judge me, and I'm going to stand before Him, and it's all going to come out. There was something too, Phil, that I thought was helpful. Somebody said, as we're trying to help people out who are lost, and the temptation might sometimes people will say, well, they're lost, they're in sin, but if I point that out, I'm going to hurt their feelings. And someone said, you need to be thinking about their feelings at the judgment day. That's the feelings that you really need to be thinking about, and to help them in the best way you can. But I really like that, the constant awareness that every day I live, the person I'm answering to is the Lord, and He sees it all. And just the motivation to not pretend and to come clean and just, live in the light.
Yeah, absolutely. Lee Buck, makes a side observation. Wouldn't trials experienced by Paul have the same effect on him as they would have on us? And I'd say the trials have the same refining impact. They will either, as Paul does in the text, burn up or refine. Just as the same impacts that hit Moses, Pharaoh, Israel, and Egypt either refined or burnt up. And you see it in the way in which those not of Israel chose to leave with Israel. The hangers-on that became folks who created the lineage of, let's say Caleb, a strong spiritual lineage that's not Israel but becomes of Israel. Rahab, etc., which creates the line of Boaz, which creates the line of Ruth, which creates, etc. The whole on tie-in there. So there's some great connections there too.
Yeah, and there's the potential to do those things, but you have to allow yourself to be refined. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that he's trying to tell them in all of this is your response. You're responsible for your response to these things, just as Paul was.
Right. Mark, you want to step ahead? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, at least on that, Phil, during this time, is that I think we have a window here with this virus, and maybe you only get one window, maybe 2 in your lifetime, kind of like this, kind of a wake-up call. I'm hoping that's what this does for a lot of us, is that it kind of helps refine, because somewhat like the parable of the sower, trials are kind of the same way. You can go through a trial and you can come out none the wiser. You can just be like that first part in the parable of the sower. And I'm hoping we avoid that. I'm hoping we're not just thinking right now, man, I just can't wait until this is over and blah, blah, blah. Instead of like, thank God for this, maybe a wake up call, etc. I want to come out of this a lot better person.
Yeah. And that's something we've kind of hinted at, especially when we went through James, the text of James, maturity makes a man. We kind of looked at it that way and broke that text down and talk about how the gospel of the kingdom, and James opens that up. This is here too. This church, the church at Corinth, has that group opportunity to decide, will we be the same or more? Mark, if you would you read verses 6 and 7 for us, 1 Corinthians chapter 4?
Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively applied to myself and Apollos for your sakes, so that in us you may learn not to exceed what is written, so that no one of you will become arrogant in behalf of one against the other. For who regards you as superior? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it?
So right here in the text, we've got quite a bit of transitional stuff. He says, verse 6, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos. That leaves us with the mystery of who actually was the puffed up people in Corinth. Was it actually Paul? Was it actually Apollos? It's certainly textually plausible that that's on the edge, but it's not likely. Likely it's somebody else. And so he uses, like we sometimes do in teaching, illustrative individuals. He says, well, what if it was Terry and I who did these things? It's a very similar thing. And yet, it still could be applied to them in a contextual way, because they are great illustrations of this struggle to separate between an adherence to a person and an adherence to Jesus himself. And that's a struggle that we all kind of walk through. But digging into the application side of the text, what are we supposed to know here? Like, what are we supposed to actually learn rather than, okay, he applied it to himself and Apollos?
And I think the context really shows that this was more about the Corinthian brethren, that none of you may be puffed up against one another. So, it seems to be that I think Paul's clearly saying, hey, look, Apollos and I are equals, and we're not trying to act superior or far more blessed than the other. And I'm applying that to both of us because you all are acting that way, which then brings that to verse 7. I thought it was interesting too, to just that idea of what did you have that you did not receive, the ESV, but then the New American Standard that Mark read, for who regards you as superior is part of that. A little bit different wording than the verse 7, who sees anything different in you. So there's this idea there that he's kind of talking about this viewing each other, being better than one another, being superior to one another. And at the end of the day, there's kind of this idea of you can't boast about any of this stuff. Like you're using this as a division, and we're better than those of Apollos, but that you have no reason to boast in any of this. Is just the most simple kind of thing to see out of this text.
It seems like they forgot that everything in the head was a gift. It almost sounds like they're singing the old Frank Sinatra or Elvis song, I Did It My Way, which seems like everyone that sings that song has a tragic, some sort of like, real, it's never a good look. And here's Paul. Paul came to them, preached, and so a lot of it goes back to him, but it goes ultimately back to God. And it's almost like the Corinthians are standing here and saying, all these spiritual gifts we have, etc., we're the source of that. And it's like, Paul's going like, what are you talking about? These are all gifts.
Yeah, I think there's, again, the internal context is really the first principle of seeing the application, because they're going to get to the latter parts of 1 Corinthians. You're going to see, the issues of who gets what gift, and they start fighting over spiritual gifts. Like, that's really ridiculous. And which one, and the arbitrary nature of the strata that they had built up about it. They argue unintentionally or intentionally about wealth. You shame those who have not. They are lax in their approach to helping people grow spiritually, with the result of harboring ongoing spiritual rebellion. And all of these things create this weird level of internal conflict. A side note is to think about Chloe's people in the midst of that. They're the ones who are accredited with reaching out to Paul, yet still part of the group. And they reach out to a third party approved source, if you will. They go to an apostle and say, hey, we got some trouble, Paul. You used to be here. you could kind of short ring that around. Side note, Rich, I can't really understand the direction of your question, so if you could rewrite it for my benefit, or if the other two guys can see it. Rich Brown has a comment because I couldn't. The sentence got blanked off. He's probably typing on his phone or something, and so he did what I would do, and my thumbs are giant and phones are small, so maybe he'll retype it for me. But
by the way, Phil, let me throw this in there. I think it's interesting in this to add in this text kind of how Paul's built up to this point. There's some you've done it too, Paul. He's quoted Isaiah in chapter 1 where it says, "I'll destroy the wisdom of the wise." Then later Jeremiah, "The one who boasts must boast in the Lord." Then chapter 3 from Job, "He catches the wise in their craftiness." It's been this kind of idea you can't boast. I'm going to destroy those who think they're wise, and all that leading up to this point then where it's kind of tied together and saying, you all think you're wise and superior, you're not, and so again, I wanted to show how this whole 4 chapter section's really been laying this groundwork. It all has to be viewed as one unit. I know we're breaking it down as a chapter a day because that's the only way we can do this. But just see how systematically Paul's been building up to this point to say what he's saying right here. Yeah. You're not superior.
Yeah.
That's,
And we might reframe it and say, we're not superior. I think it's probably the inclusive model that Terry's certainly reaching for. So I think I understand Rich's combo question. Jay, help me out. Are you asking if we are guilty of judging because we are associated with a particular preacher or if we know a particular preacher? And I think we do that sometimes. You worshiped over at building X and preacher Y was there. And preacher Y is not very good, or preacher Y has this weird view, or when I knew preacher Y in college, he was X, Y, Z, Q, or he said this one mean thing once. All that stuff that is like low-level trash that exists in relationships. Certainly there's a struggle there to separate from the person to know, what did he teach? Did he teach me to get closer to Jesus? Did he teach accurate truth to the best of his ability? Did he correct himself when he made spiritual mistakes? When he was inaccurate in his preaching? Did he fix that? Did he do his best? And those are better questions than, well, I read so-and-so said such and such about this thing over there, and ergo you are now a horrible whatever. And so, Rich, I think there's a certain tenor to that for sure. The context, though, is more internal, but the application certainly could go that way. Mark, I know you had something you were going to slip in there too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It looks like the culture they've allowed the culture to have a big influence on them, going back to chapter 1 and 2 of just the, I guess people didn't view the gospel as sophisticated enough, that you had to be like the philosophy, etc. And I think that's a danger sometimes, is that we see a simple passage that it's almost like when Jesus told the woman caught in adultery, sin no more. A lot of people going like, well, that's not going to work. Things are more complicated than that. But I just like it when we kind of strip that all away, because the Corinthians had been in all sorts of sin. And Paul says, and such were some of you, is that there's a beautiful simplicity about the gospel that just can cut through anything. And instead of arguing with the text or arguing like, well, that won't work, why don't you just trust God and start living it?
Yeah. I think that ties in as well. 1 Corinthians 3 verses 1 through 4, like Terry pointed out, you see that illustrative connection back to where they were and where they could be. But then we move forward in the text and we jump in now and say verse 8 through we'll read all the way through verse 13 right now. And I'm going to go ahead and read that text for us and move us forward some. So 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 8 and following. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. And would that you did reign, so that we might share the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. To the present hour we hunger and thirst. We are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still, like scum of the world, the refuse of all things. If you want to have a dissertation on a biblical clapback, diss, shade, or a burn, you have now encountered Paul employing all of those rhetorical tools in like 2 sentences. And he drops it on them like a ton of bricks. Would that we rule together.
This is the what Tim Beckley said earlier about the Elijah-esque amount of sarcasm. This section reeks of that, right? That's where this is. If there ever was a section where that's true, it's right here in this section, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's such depth to the contrast between, say, verse 13 and verse 8. We have become and are still like scum of the world. Already you have all what you want. We are basically, without us, you have become kings. Like you didn't need it. You're kings now. Again, there are certain ways to read the text, and this right here, the reading of the text has to be deep sarcasm, like beyond the level of the teenage mind type of sarcasm, because that's like their normal speak. Teenagers are like imbued with special qualities of sarcasm, eye rolling and all of that. Well, Paul is taking it to a whole nother level here, and that shifts how we see the text, for sure.
You know, it almost looks like the poor Corinthians are thinking that they have moved so beyond him that they're, and not only that, but now and then, Phil, I think we kind of encounter this, that there's a version of Christianity that we can create, which will be popular with the world and will bring us no persecution. I think Paul just reminds us all that desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Is that if they hated Jesus, you're not going to be able to make them necessarily like you. And it looks like the Corinthians were trying to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because in a sense, right, these Paul and Apollos, even, they're the spiritual fathers, right? They're the ones that in a sense spiritually not created but mentored these folks. And then he comes in with this, I mean, dripping, oh, you're rich without us. I wish we could rule with you. Yeah, we're weak, but you're so strong, right? I mean, that whole idea, and the way he really introduces that in that direct contrast, you're rich, you're kings, we're scum of the earth. You know, you talk about just really blatant, in your face kind of, and it's just amazing to see that whole section and how he's talking about, and I think the part that's interesting is, you know, the way he describes him and the other teachers as being homeless and labor, but being poorly dressed and buffeted and reviled and persecuted. Like those things were true, right? I mean, that to a degree, all of those things were true of them, but the Corinthian brethren were so far beyond everything they were. Well, it's because they weren't practicing the right things. You know, the only way you could be that rich and that much better off is not to be in Christ, was really what the whole point is saying here. And he, again, is laying this groundwork to say, you're not who you're supposed to be. And then we're going to get into all these things that have come out of that.
The statement that always has caught my mind is that we are fools for Christ's sake. Is that as a faithful Christian, you have to be willing to be viewed at times by the world as a fool for Christ's sake. Like, I mean, people will say things, Phil, like, what, you don't drink and why here's all these instant pleasures around you. I mean, you're a nut if you're not doing that. And it's like, yeah, I'm a fool for Christ's sake, but I'm a very happy fool.
Yeah. Well, and I use this basic illustration as well as the, lifestyle choices, including, dress and all that different stuff that kind of come in there. Look, yeah, I do make a huge effort to be with my brethren on the first day of the week. And sometimes that is weird to social friends, scouters, sport families, whatever. Like you drove an hour? Why didn't you go to one of the other 8 trillion things we offered to you as options? You drove 2 hours, 3 hours? What's so special about that? Well, it's special. It is my short answer. You're welcome to come along.
Yeah,
Um,
Edwin brings in, by the way, this imagery of this idea of being led and paraded on your way to death.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that I saw earlier this morning, I was kind of looking through this connectivity to when the kings would come back from war and they'd bring the spoils of war, they'd bring with them the men that they had conquered and had collected as prisoners of war. And by the end of the day, those people would either be sentenced to death or they would be sold as slaves. That was really the two kind of possible outcomes. Paul uses that imagery really of what the Corinthian brethren have done, is that they're the kings leading him and Apollos and Cephas in this spectacle parade, in a sense. And at the end of the day, they're so useless to the Corinthian brethren because of what they've done. They're either going to be sold off as slaves or put to death. Which is pretty interesting in that kind of sense. So I think that imagery is pretty heavy there and just needs to be seen, and ties that together really well, what he's really trying to accuse them of.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I noted that too, and almost it's like the Corinthians didn't have a whole lot of use for Paul, but there might be a reminder here of maybe the Corinthians don't realize that the focal point of the world that time, and even angels, is upon men like Paul, Apollos, and the apostles, and the work that they're doing. I don't know, it's one of those things that sometimes you don't understand how great your parents are when you're younger. Maybe a similar illustration.
oh yeah, for sure. Like, parents are dumb when you're in the house. Eventually, they turn into brilliant masterminds who can solve all your problems. And if you're a teenager or a young person listening to this, write that down. It's a truth that at least all three of us, I think, can say is pretty much true. Um, Let me add something else. I think this is important. It's kind of a gut check, especially in concert with some of our earlier conversations just even this morning. Typically, when you employ a rhetorical tool of these great extremes, I'm poor, you're rich, you exaggerate. You expand the margins of the bar and you say, well, reality is here, but I'm going to go to here with it. But here's something to think about. Paul's description of his personal state, to a certain degree, is accurate. So his physical state, as described, is accurate, if not generously beneficial to his actual circumstances. Because he doesn't right now talk about being left for dead. He does later. And he doesn't talk about being tried to regularly sought to be killed by his own countrymen. And so here's the gut chat part of it. We've talked about the transformation process of being in this part of our lives that's weird compared to before. How much of our lives are making us more into the fat cows of Bashan instead of Paul? And how much of our congregational relationships are built more on the Corinthian model than on the Pauline model? Because there's two different things. And chew on that for a while, because I know I will be. And I noticed that in the text in preparation. I thought, you know what, this is something really important, because we live in Corinth, in the grandness of the American empire. And it is an empire. And it is slowly coming to grips with its extents of that empire crumbling on the edges. And so there's some stuff there to think about. You guys can make extra comments. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I think it'd be important for all of us to consider some ways as well.
Yeah, I know, Phil, a number of people, of course, right now are worried about, well, not just the virus, but it seems like a lot of worries are about the economy and all of that. But what worries me? What worries me is when we all go back to normal, because prosperity, it seems that in the last 50 years or so, that prosperity has been a lot more dangerous threat to the Lord's church than hardship. And I don't know, just are we gonna go back, and is it just going to be going back to normal? And are we going to be that third soil in the parable of the sower, just weighed down with our stuff and what people think and peer pressure and all those other things? That's what really worries me.
And Mark, the last 25 years, I think, is a really good test case of that, right? Because after 9/11, what happened? We had kind of a religious explosion in our country. Churches were built, buildings were built, and church buildings were built. Let me say it that way. Mega churches existed. What's really interesting about that is that not long after that, when the economy reset, where we started flourishing again, what really happened then was suddenly a lot of those church buildings were empty and churches didn't exist, and there was bankruptcy by a lot of those groups. And now here we have another opportunity that we have this kind of reset and reboot for us to not be prosperous for a while, come back to our senses. It's the same cycle to some degree that Phil and Jared have been looking at in the warlord study of prosperity and falling away and then coming back. And it's just the same thing continues on. And my thing is, I think that we'll have a religious, kind of revival, not just in our brethren, but in the country as a whole. The question becomes, how long will that last? Like, what's the expiration date on that this time? And can we maintain it? What can we do to sustain it? Because we've been here before, historically.
Time says we have to move forward, even though there's a ton of stuff we could dig in deeper here. Who would like to read the last outgoing section, the last few verses, verse 14 through the end? Whoever gets there first gets to read. Is probably the mathematical equation.
I got it. I do not write these things to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. For if you were to have countless tutors in Christ, yet you would not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus, I became your father through the gospel. Therefore, I exhort you, be imitators of me. For this reason, I've sent you Timothy, who is my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, and he will remind you of my ways which are in Christ, just as I teach everywhere in every church. Now, some have become arrogant as though I were not coming to you, but I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I shall find out not the words of those who are arrogant, but their power. For the kingdom of God does not consist in words, but in power. What do you desire? Shall I come to you with a rod, or with love and a spirit of gentleness?
So, one of the quick points I always make in teaching this text is the reminder that sarcasm can teach. It can admonish. But what matters is the heart of the sarcastic comment. Is it real? Is it genuine? Is it sarcasm for the sake of sarcasm? Is it designed to spear a heart, to pierce a heart? Those are two different things. What's the desired outcome? I think there is certainly some great space for us to dig through now as we think about, okay, we've just hopefully been admonished as children too. Because when Paul writes a letter to the church of Corinth, I always try to assume he's writing it to me too. And so what lessons do we make? So quick observations, important things in these last two verses. What do we need to know?
A couple of things, Phil. I think you're right, is that Paul says, here's my motivation. I'm not trying to destroy you. In fact, I love you. I love you. Maybe God's the only one that loves you more than I do, because I'm the one that came and preached there and taught you and etc. I love his relationship with Timothy. Timothy's dependable, faithful. All the apostles and Timothy, they're all on the same page. They have the same consistent teaching wherever they are at. He's not like massaging the message for particular audiences. You see here, he's strong. He's not a pushover. He's a meek man, but basically says, hey, when I'm showing up, all those people saying that I'm afraid and I'm in person, I'm unimpressive. We're really going to see what they're kind of made of, is that he's not afraid to face them. I do love verse 21, kind of like what the pew gets the preaching it kind of deserves, or I don't know if that's the right word, but there's a statement me and my wife have been saying, is that you get the pizza you order. And I think that's what Paul is saying right now, that you guys are going to get the pizza that you're ordering right now. So be careful what you order.
I'm going to write that down, Terry.
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I think it's interesting. We've talked about this whole section of him kind of clapping back, and especially to those who are speaking against him, and he really goes after this group, what he calls the arrogant, who are going around saying he's not going to come. And he says in there, so you have before verse 21, I could come with a rod or with love and the spirit of gentleness. But before that, he's saying, some of you are arrogant saying I'm not going to come. I'm going to come. And then when I come, we're going to find out if you're just all talk or if you have any power behind what you're saying. And it's, I mean, you talk about bold, right? I mean, this is kind of like, reminds me of those times with my son when he was turning like 18, 19, 20, and he was a football player and he was strong and all this stuff, and truthfully stronger than me. But there comes a point sometimes you just got to look in the face. Okay, we're going to see whether you're a man or not. You think you are. Let's find out if you're ready for this, because I got old man strength, right? You don't realize what that is till you get to be an old man, right? Phil, you know what I'm talking about. And I know Mark does. Like when I was 18, 19, 20, I looked at these guys like me and I'm like, oh, I could take him. And the reality is, no, I got old man strength. Like, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And I think there's a little bit of that with Paul. Like, he's like, okay, we're going to find out what you're made of. It's the old Roy D. Mercer phone call. If you ever heard those, how big a boy are you? Kind of statement here at the end. But there's that out to say, hey, look, I can come with a spirit of gentleness if you guys will straighten up, which I think is beautiful. And there is very much that whole section has very much, I think, this father overtone. It reminds me of his writing to the Thessalonians brethren when he talked about that he came with the nurturing of a mother, but also the stern correction of a father, right? And this reminds me of that. Well, I'm your father in the faith. I'm coming. You get to decide how you're treated when I come. You know, it's kind of like that. Don't make me come in there. Yeah, don't make me come in there kind of thing. But when I come, do you want the belt or do you want to go get ice cream? Like, which one do you want? This kind of thing. That's what I see in that whole section there.
Awesome observations today, guys. We're thankful that Mark could be with us. There's a lot more in each of these chapters that we can dig into. But as we do, we're going to go around the horn. That gives all of our sport fanatic friends a moment to reflect on the lack of live sport endeavors for them to participate and to watch. But Terry, what's your last thoughts for us today? Things are looking forward to. I know we do this every day, but we're going to keep doing it.
Just a couple of things. I got a couple of prayer requests for just people. There's a good couple friend of ours in Memphis. Their last name is Stacks, Dan and Kathy Stacks. They're involved in a pretty bad accident last night. And just with all the other things, there's complications with both of them having to go to the hospital. They weren't even taken to the same hospital, a lot of things. And both of them are facing surgeries. Just pray for Dan and Kathy Stacks. And the numerous people that have the virus that we know at this point. That list is getting too long to mention. Just pray for them, continue to pray for them. One final thought from here is, this talks about judgment. We could take that verse 21, we could apply that to us in the Lord, that when judgment comes, we'll either have a rod or a spirit of gentleness, and it's up to us to decide which one of those two we receive. And the way you live your life today decides that.
Yep. Mark?
I really like that verse 21 because you see God there. God does not want to bring judgment. I think the Old Testament talks about it being his foreign. It's his foreign task or whatever. It's the last thing that he wants to do. And I guess that needs to be part of our character, hopefully, as we grow old, that we can be pointed with people when needed, when they really need to hear something, but also that we have a very tender, merciful side. And Paul is saying, when I come back to Corinth and show up, I'd rather it be a real nice, pleasant time and visit. That we would prefer that we would always prefer to extend kindness.
Yeah, and looking forward to a theoretical kind opportunity. I would love to sit down with you at Hunan Pearl, maybe some Busters, and have a little chat, Mark. It's been great to catch up with you in this way. Maybe you can box it up and bring it with you when you come this way. Either of those options are good. Like Terry and like Mark, I'm looking forward to good times. In the middle of this experience and setting, we need to continue to reach our hearts towards those who are having bad times. 3 of the churches I'm aware of in the New York area have had lost members to COVID-19. They have contracted disease and they've lost their lives. Many of the shepherds I know are talking about how it's affected their congregations. It is an ongoing issue. It is also being attacked by the reality that our economy will be different afterwards. Both of these are parallel truths that are challenging to figure out what to do, but they're nothing new in the human experience. These seasons of pestilence and seasons of poverty and seasons of good growth and of blessing are normal cycles in the history of man. The core for us is to make sure that we do something that is kind of obvious, but hard. Trust. We've got to trust in our King. We've got to trust in his plan for us. And as always, he seeks to bless us. He wants to give us his good blessings. His blessings are real and tangible. They're found in their fullest realization in the kingdom, and that's his desire for us. And we've said this regularly, we keep saying it. If you're watching these studies and you want to know more, reach out to any of us. We'll be happy to talk. We're happy to sit down and open our Bibles together and to dig into the richness that is Jesus. And so in all things, may God bless you and may your hearts be made full.